This is the Booth story. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1838 to Junius Booth and Mary Ann Holmes, Junius's mistress. The Booth family was a well-known theatrical family. Booth, his father, and several siblings were all actors. Although John Wilkes Booth is best known for assassinating President Lincoln in 1865, Booth escaped and ended up in Northern Virginia, where he was shot and killed.
The official version of the United States government regarding John Wilkes Booth's death is that he died 12 days after assassinating Abraham Lincoln. He died in Virginia, in the barn of a gentleman named Garrett. In Garrett's tobacco barn, Union soldiers surrounded it. Booth was inside. The government says that he was ordered to come out. He refused. The soldiers set fire to the barn. While the fire was burning, a shot rang out. And one of the Union soldiers, a man by the name of Boston Corbett, shot and killed John Wilkes Booth. When Corbett was arrested for shooting Booth because he violated what some say was a direct order not to shoot, he was asked, "Why did you fire?" And his response was, "God bid me to." He was arrested, taken back to D.C. in the same wagon that the body that the government says was John Wilkes Booth was taken in. The soldiers pulled the body out of the barn, wrapped it in a burlap bag. No identification was made by any family members because there was, of course, no family with him. It was taken to a ship on the Potomac called the Merrimac, and two surgeons for the United States Army made identification of the body. No family members were called to identify the body. The body then was rewrapped in the burlap bag, and the government said to the press at the time that it was dumped, weighted down and dumped in the Potomac. But in reality, the government took the body to the Washington Arsenal. In fact, there's still a fort there today, still operated by the United States Army. It's right next to the Washington Nationals baseball park. And they buried the body underneath a storage room where it remained for 4 years, until word got out that the body was there, and the brother of John Wilkes Booth, Edwin Booth, requested of President Andrew Johnson that the body be given back to the Booth family. In 1869, 4 years after the murder and assassination of Lincoln and the death of John Wilkes Booth, according to the government, the body was exhumed, taken back to the very place Lincoln was shot, to the alley called Baptist Alley behind the theater. And Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes Booth, identified the body there. Only problem was the body was skeletal, and the identification was by clothing. And some of the people who claimed to have been there with Edwin Booth said that the body that they saw, the skeleton, had red hair, not dark hair like Booth. Now, as to what the family did was they took the body in the barn back to Baltimore, Maryland, and they buried it in the cemetery where the Booth family is buried. And the government says that is where the body remains to this day. In 1996, not 1896, 1996, just 15 years ago, the descendants of John Wilkes Booth filed suit against the cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland, and the state of Maryland and the city of Baltimore, desiring to exhume the body, to do testing, to prove that the body in the barn was not John Wilkes Booth. 26 of the 27 living descendants of the Booth family believe that the body buried in Baltimore is not their forefather. They believe, and the argument they made in court was that John Wilkes Booth died in Enid, Oklahoma on January the 13th, 1903. And the reason that they believe it is what many call the Booth legend, but it is a fascinating story that, whether it's true or not, is a story in and of itself.
So is John Wilkes Booth actually buried at the Booth family cemetery plot? Did he actually die on Garrett's farm in Northern Virginia? Or maybe he actually died in a room like this, where he locked himself in and committed suicide at the Grand Hotel in Enid, Oklahoma.
Well, what the Booth family today says is that Booth escaped the barn, that the government was complicit in allowing Booth to escape, particularly Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, who did not like Lincoln, according to the Booth family. And so the government allowed Booth to escape because he was, in essence, an agent assigned to assassinate the president. That the person who died in the barn was not John Wilkes Booth, but a person commonly known as Rudy or Ruddy, however you would pronounce his name. Booth left Virginia, made his way eventually to Texas, took the name David E. George. Eventually, first he took the name John St. Helen, met an attorney in Texas using the alias John St. Helen, an attorney named Finis Bates, who is the grandfather of actress Kathy Bates, and went on to become the Attorney General for the state of Tennessee. As John St. Helen, Finis Bates defended him in court in Granbury, Texas, against a violation of the liquor laws, and became a friend to John St. Helen. One day John St. Helen became very ill, called for his attorney. John St. Helen thought he was dying, and he confessed to his attorney that he was John Wilkes Booth. He eventually recovered from his illness, and Finis Bates recorded the conversation that he had, with notes by hand, regarding the assassination of Lincoln and how Booth escaped. One day, Finis Bates was in his office when federal marshals showed up asking about John St. Helen. Finis Bates said that he went looking for John St. Helen to warn his client and couldn't find him. He had fled. For 20 years, attorney Finis Bates sought to find John St. Helen. In fact, in the late 1890s, he filed a claim with the United States government saying that John Wilkes Booth did not die, that he was still living, he was going under an alias, and that he would assist the government if they would give him the reward money. The government sent him a terse letter back saying, "We are not interested."
It is much more pleasurable for the Booth family to hear that their forefather lived out his life rather than being killed in the tobacco barn in Northern Virginia.
Fast forward now to 1903. In downtown Enid, Oklahoma, in a hotel, the Grand Avenue Hotel, in room number 4, there are screams that are heard by the proprietor of the hotel. She and her husband go up to the second floor where room number 4 is located, And they try to get in, but the door is locked. But there's a transom above the door. So they open up the transom, and they get a little boy that they lift up, and he jumps.
They came up here, and the door was locked, and the innkeeper or whoever was here did not want to damage the door, so they got a little 10-year-old kid, and the transom was open, and they shinnied the little kid into had him drop in through the transom and unlock the door, and there they found Booth on the bed gagging and writhing from the poison, and so they sent the kid down around the square to find a doctor, and probably sent him over to the drugstore too, because at the time the druggists were kind of shade tree doctors, and by the time they got back up here, and they were gathered around the body doing this and that, he expired.
They take his body across the street to the furniture store, Penniman Furniture Store, which in those days doubled as the funeral home. That was a common practice. The next morning, the Enid newspaper says, David E. George commits suicide. And then they give an article regarding David E. George, how he had come from El Reno, how he was a house painter, how he was known to quote Shakespeare, how he would often be drunk in the bars in downtown Enid, and so on. Just so happens that the Methodist minister in Enid and his wife had come from El Reno a year before. He reads the article to his wife, and his wife says, "That sure sounds like a man we knew in El Reno that I cared for." She was a nurse. "And he told me he was John Wilkes Booth. Do you think it could be the same man?" He said, "I'll go find out." He goes down to the funeral home. He tells Mr. Penniman what his wife told him. It is the same man because he recognizes him from El Reno. He says, "You better preserve the body because government officials are going to want to take the body." So they preserve the body, waiting for the government to come claim. Word begins to spread, particularly through the Associated Press. Finis Bates is now in Memphis, Tennessee. He's been Attorney General. He reads it in the Memphis newspaper about the death of a man who had claimed to be John Wilkes Booth. He gets on a train, comes to Enid, because he's thinking to himself, could this be the man I knew 20 years earlier as John St. Helen? The story goes that he walks into Penniman Furniture Store, and Mr. Penniman says, this attorney, Finis Bates, turns white as a sheet when he sees the body, and he utters, "There you are, my long-lost friend," remembering he'd been looking for him for now almost 25 years.
This story enhances the Booth's family idea that John Wilkes Booth did escape. This story, though, could be true, although family members are more likely to side with other family members as compared to the government or outsiders.
Mr. Bates asks about the body, and Mr. Penniman says, well, we're waiting for the government to come claim it. Someone from the government shows up. Nobody is sure who, says we're not interested. Nobody else claims the body. So Mr. Bates makes an appeal to the territory of Oklahoma to take the body back to Memphis with him, which he did. And he keeps the body in his basement. And he writes a book entitled The Escape and Suicide at the End of the Trail of John Wilkes Booth in Enid, Oklahoma. He publishes it in 1907, and it becomes an instant bestseller. Sells almost 100,000 copies. This is the basis for the lawsuit of the Booth family in 1996. However, Finis Bates lost his reputation because of the book. Many people believed the book. Others did not, thought he was a crackpot. One of the men who believed Finis Bates was the first president of the Oklahoma Historical Society. He was the former editor of the Kingfisher newspaper. He himself wrote a book. I was looking just the other day. The book is now out of print. You can buy it on eBay. $1,600. Where the first president of the Oklahoma Historical Society says Finus Bates is not only accurate in saying this is John Wilkes Booth. Finus Bates has done an incredible job of research. I've read Finus Bates' book, and there are some discrepancies with of course, the official government version. But what's interesting is, before the government ever released the details to the public of John Wilkes Booth capture, which didn't occur, they sealed him for many, many years. Finus Bates was writing some things that nobody could have known. For example, the items that Booth allegedly left in the woods. The government did not release that to the public. Finus Bates articulates exactly what was left, including glasses, binoculars, a diary, and so on.
Could it be that Finus Bates sees an opportunity? He did write a book, and it would make him money. It was stated that a gentleman from El Reno thought the government would want the body, but the government never came. You would think that if there was a cover-up going on, that the government would want the body to completely disappear.
Because what ended up happening was the mummy went on a tour of the United States. Life magazine in 1938. This is like the modern day Time magazine. This was the magazine of the United States. They did a story of the Booth mummy, and so even the mummy is a story in itself. It toured the United States. Henry Ford was going to purchase the mummy, sent his PR director to find out about it. And for 2 years they investigated it, and all the paperwork in their investigation is now under seal. Henry Ford eventually didn't purchase the mummy. By the way, an autopsy was done in Chicago by the leading experts when Henry Ford was looking at buying it. They found a ring in the mummy's stomach with the initials JWB. They found that the eyebrow was scarred, the same way John Wilkes Booth's eyebrow was scarred. They found a broken tibia on the proper leg of that which Booth should have broken. And in the autopsy, the doctors reported the wrong leg being broken on the body in the barn. So that's some of the evidence that's out there.
If Henry Ford was interested in purchasing this mummy, then it must have been true. It must have been that this mummy was John Wilkes Booth. But then I wonder, why did Henry Ford not actually go through with the purchase of this mummy? Possibly it could be that he knew facts that crushed his idea that this mummy was John Wilkes Booth.
But one of the interesting things that they did was they interviewed, this is back in the 30s, John Wilkes Booth's niece. And I think I told you, she swore in an affidavit that she was in Enid in the fall of 1902 at the Enid Opera House performing. Blanche DeBar was her name. She was a beautiful woman. She was now older, but she was an actress and a singer. And she heard a knock on the door, and she didn't answer it. And then a note was slid underneath the door that said, "Wouldn't you like to meet your Johnny?" And that's what her favorite uncle, John Wilkes Booth, called himself. By the time she picked the note up after she had finished getting ready, she opened up the door. Nobody was there, but she swore that her uncle tried to contact her in Enid just a few weeks before David E. George committed suicide in the Grand Avenue Hotel.
Testimonials can be an antidote for reasoning, but it does not equal evidence. It is possible that Blanche wanted to believe her uncle was alive.
There's a minister by the name of Clarence Truelove. If you ever do some research on this, Clarence Truelove was fascinated by the mummy. He at one time owned it. Clarence Truelove headed up the prohibitionist movement in the United States. He staked his reputation on the mummy being John Wilkes Booth. He showed it. It fell into the hands of different carnival operators, and that's where a lot of the problem comes, because if you've got a carnival operator who's got a mummy who's saying this is John Wilkes Booth, taking it to carnivals all around the United States, then your professional historians are going to say, this is just so silly, so stupid, but they don't know the background. They don't know the more traditional, professional, finest baits, that type of thing. All they hear is carnival, and they say, oh, that's crackpot.
And then the mummy was sold to the circus. And again, well, how do you know that? Well, for the circus industry has trade magazines, just like the furniture business, car business, whatever. And the mummy was documented, photographed, and followed in the trade journals of the circus industry, which you can look it up today. And it traveled around the country, and originally they had $1,000 bond if you could prove that this was not the mummy of John Wilkes Booth. We'll pay you $1,000. That was their ploy at the circus. So there were even knockoffs of it. At one time, there were 3 or 4 different Booth mummies traveling the country, according to the trade journals of the circus industry. But the one original mummy that came from Enid mainly stayed in the Midwest. Well, then after World War II, that mummy disappeared. And the official statement was the mummy was in a rooming house in Philadelphia, and it was torn down. It was hauled out with the rubble. Again, that mummy is somewhere, maybe, maybe not. But perhaps somebody will die up in Buffalo, New York, and they'll go in their basement and find a panel, and there'll be an Indian chief and a outlaw, and then a scraggly looking guy with a little wire tag that says Booth on it tied to his finger, which is possible, because if that mummy was handed over, the government would take it, and no one would want to lose one of the crown jewels of their collection, I would think. I wouldn't.
In early 1970s, the mummy was on a train being transported, and the train crashed. The mummy disappeared. Someone has said that they saw it in Chicago in 1976.
There are many inconsistencies in the mummy story, and now the mummy is lost. And because it is lost, we cannot use the mummy to either confirm or disconfirm the Booth story. Therefore, the Booth story is not falsifiable.
Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. He was shot on the night of April 14th, died at about 7:21 on the morning of April the 15th, 1865. And all of a sudden here in 1903, in Enid, Oklahoma, John Booth is discovered. That, to me, that just, when so many people identified him, saw him, knew him, and his last words when he died was, "Tell Mother I died for my country." It just, the myth says one thing, but the evidence is so strong with all of those people gathered around.
When John Wilkes Booth was shot and killed in Garrett's barn, there were many spectators and military personnel that witnessed his death. You would think that if it didn't look like John Wilkes Booth, that someone would have spoke up, seeing as he was a pretty famous actor and a lot of people knew what he looked like. But it's not necessarily true that someone would speak up, as we are heavily influenced by those around us and what they think. If nobody else spoke up, it's like the bystander effect. Nobody else wants to either.
They dragged him out of the barn and took him in, or put him on the front porch of the Garrett farmhouse. And he, according to the sources, he begged them to kill him, go ahead and finish him off. And they told him that, no, we want you to live. But, and I mean, you know, here's a whole army that has seen this guy. And Booth was a familiar enough figure that surely if this guy had been, I notice Bates calls him John Ward and, or John Boyd and all kinds of names. But it just seems to me that somebody there would have recognized him as not being Booth. But to me, with all the people who identified him, the people who saw him, I don't think there's any question. In this book, Dale Carnegie's book, he's the one who mentioned, I think, that there were, I think, 10 or 12 people who identified the body of Lincoln. It says that there's never been a dead person that's been more identified than Booth, and his mother was one of the ones that was supposed to have identified his body, according to the Carnegie.
Is Carnegie a reliable source for information on John Wilkes Booth? First we hear that no one identified the body, and then we hear later that lots of people identified the body.
They took from his body a diary, a wallet, picture of several female actresses that Booth had dated. All of those things. And my question has been, how did they, if this guy really was Booth, where did they make this exchange? But according to Bates, what happened, when they pulled Booth out from under all the straw that he had been covered with, when he starts to make his escape, he realizes he's lost his wallet, he's lost his diary, all these sort of things. So he sends this guy back to collect it, where they put him in the wagon, thinking maybe that's where it's going to be. And supposedly, when the guy was shot up there in Virginia, in the barn, it's interesting, you know, Booth had a broken foot, but this guy that was covering for him, I guess he had a broken foot too, because he's hobbling around on a crutch. And he's the one who's supposed to be, who is supposed to have retrieved all this stuff that Booth lost. And they take it all out and turn it over to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. It defies my imagination, to be honest with you. And you know, over the years, just seeing the sources, to me, there's nothing, absolutely nothing that's documented in this book, The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth, that this Bates guy wrote. He documents nothing. No one knew they went outside the city a half mile, sat down on a pile of rocks, and this guy told him the whole story about how the assassination took place. It is, to me, it's just totally fabricated. All of the sources I have, I've never seen anything that supported John Booth dying in Enid, Oklahoma. When this guy died down at the furniture store, there was nothing to, no birth certificate, you know, just nobody there to say, well, yeah, he really is John Booth, other than the fact that he said he was John Booth. Now, you know, I could say I'm Elvis Presley, but ain't nobody gonna believe it, so, you know.
Garrison seems to be trusting facts. Facts from the government and other sources, such as books. So why would Booth send a wounded man back to Virginia to retrieve the items he forgot? They didn't have cars, just wagons, horseback, trains, and on foot. A wounded man going back to Garrett's farm to pick up items. You would think that he would have sent a healthy individual.
Like I say, I've always had a deep interest in Abraham Lincoln. I personally think he's the greatest president we ever had, but that's, just a personal opinion, I guess. But he did save the Union, and the way he was killed, I can't imagine anybody. I tell some of these folks that want to believe this guy that died here in Enid was John Booth. I said, man, I can't. It grieves me to even think he might have ever been in Oklahoma. What was interesting, this David George wound up in El Reno, and he got sick, and the Methodist preacher's wife was a nurse, and she was taking care of him, and then he thought he was dying, and so he tells him he's John Booth. Well, when he died, and I noticed the article that came out in the Enid newspaper, has this Methodist minister's wife going down and identifying the body the day before he died, or the day before he committed suicide. Which, to me, that's the whole story. It's like Bates' book. He's got him going to Iowa to visit his daughter when she lived in New Jersey, and he's got Andrew Johnson being part of the assassination, and just none of it ever comes together. And if I believed it, it would defy everything I've ever been taught.
If the story is too good to be true, then it usually is. Now, Garrison taught the Lincoln assassination and all about John Wilkes Booth in the public school system for years. Is it possible that Garrison is biased in his thinking due to not wanting to be wrong? Is the idea that Garrison taught the wrong thing in the schools to children getting in the way of an open mind? Maybe.
When this guy Bates came up from Tennessee, he wound up taking the body, and one of these, the American Brutus, this book here, this guy says what he hoped to do was to collect a reward from the government. And of course the government didn't go along with that. And when that didn't materialize, he takes the body around to carnivals and pay 10 cents and you can view the body of John Wilkes Booth.
Now, Garrison believes that Finus Bates was looking for reward money. The government never actually paid out reward money on the mummy. That mummy was actually used by Finus Bates in a way to earn extra money. He took it on a carnival tour all around the country and charged a fee to view the mummy of John Wilkes Booth. Is this opportunity for income the reason why Bates didn't write the book until after David E. George's death? He didn't see the opportunity to make the money and didn't have the Booth connection until David E. George was gone.
So the story obviously is an incredible one. You either have to say that the person who died in Garrett's farm in Virginia is John Wilkes Booth, or like Booth's family, you say he's not, and he died in Enid, Oklahoma. Now, the way to determine which is true or which is accurate today is DNA testing. Thus the lawsuit. The Maryland Supreme Court ruled against the family and for the cemetery. The cemetery said we have an obligation to Booth's mother, who signed the contract, that the body is not to be disturbed. The family was going to file an appeal to the United States Supreme Court and miss the appeal by 1 day. But lo and behold, a resolution has now been solved, or come to. The government, at the autopsy on the Merrimack, on the Potomac, took two pieces of the body that was found in the barn. They took a portion of, I think it's the seventh vertebrae, and another portion of the body, and they are preserved in formaldehyde in the Mutter Museum, which is run by the United States Army. The family has requested those pieces of the body in the barn to be tested for DNA and compared to the body of Edwin Booth that the cemetery where Edwin Booth is buried has allowed to be exhumed. So testing by the Smithsonian Institute is currently being run. It's November of 2011, and in the spring of 2012, the results of DNA testing will come out, which should lay this to rest. If the DNA from the body in the barn is John Wilkes Booth, it will be seen through his brother Edwin Booth, and it will be a match. But if it comes back and it's not a match, then little old Enid, Oklahoma is going to explode on the front page of newspapers across the world.
Some resolution may come the spring of 2012 that may put some of this story to rest. For years, the Booth story has not been falsifiable, but now it may.
So we believe Booth did escape and wandered around because there are, again, articles in the newspapers and periodicals of the time. Booth sighted in Mexico, Booth sighted in South America, Booth in Jerusalem, Booth in Canada, and so on.
There are other stories that exist about John Wilkes Booth and his escape from Garrett's barn. One says that he escaped to a boat and sailed to Europe. This is where he lived a long, good life. Another story tells of how Booth was actually killed by Jesse James. The bottom line is that everyone loves a good story. Now always remember, convergence of evidence, trust your facts, and always evaluate your source.
I believe it very, very, very well was Booth that was here.
I believe John Booth's acting career ended. Tell Mother I died for my country.
You know, in terms of the evidence, ultimately the DNA evidence is the way to go. So I kind of reserve judgment. You know, people can make their arguments, but once you get DNA testing, then you'll know. So whether you believe it or not is not an issue to me. I'm not trying to convince anybody. I just find it a fascinating story.